Good morning and welcome. I'm Jackie Walorski from the Indiana 2nd District, thanking you for joining us today for this discussion. We appreciate your participation in this roundtable to examine the ongoing problem of fraud in COVID pandemic unemployment programs. I also want to thank my colleagues for joining today and for helping to plan this meeting. As ranking member of the Worker and Family Support Subcommittee, I take seriously my role to ensure the integrity and success of the programs that we oversee. Generous unemployment benefits put in place by the CARES Act, including the additional $300 federal supplement, are discharging workers and making it hard for employers to hire. They've become an easy target for criminals. Unchecked unemployment fraud is delaying legitimate payments, diverting funds away from unemployed workers, and turning thousands of Americans into unwitting identity theft victims. This roundtable today provides a forum for hearing from state leaders, employers, victims, to highlight the voices that are of those that are impacted. In Indiana, since the beginning of COVID, our state's Department of Workforce has processed nearly 1.3 million claims for unemployment, and the department estimates 15% have been flagged for fraud indicators. I'm grateful to have Doug Swetnam from the Indiana Attorney General's office with us today to talk more about how the state is addressing this challenge. As far back as last summer, multiple reports from the Department of Justice, the U.S. Secret Service, and the GAO have raised the alarm bells about widespread fraud resulting in billions of dollars being diverted. Criminal organizations, including international cybercrime rings, prison inmates, and opportunistic foreign actors, are using stolen identities to falsely claim unemployment benefits. The Department of Labor's Inspector General estimates that more than $63 billion in unemployment benefits have been paid out improperly during COVID, with a significant portion attributable to fraud. This is roughly 10% of the total amount paid since March of 2020. The agency's initial pandemic audit and investigative work indicate program improper payments will be higher and could be as much as $89 billion. Let's pause to think about that. $63 billion, a frightening number, larger than the entire budget of the Department of Homeland Security. To make it worse, state efforts to combat cyber criminals have been hamstrung by lax program rules that allow self-certification and prioritize getting benefits out the door over making sure they are going to the right people. With new reports of fraud surfacing daily, I'm concerned about the lack of oversight and action. Democrats extended COVID unemployment programs through September 6th with no additional protections against fraud, and without having held a single hearing how to determine how to prevent further fraud from occurring. This, despite repeated warnings about the vulnerability for abuse and calls for oversight hearings. We cannot continue to let this federal practice of quote unquote pay and chase. There is too much at stake. Republicans on this committee are developing a number of proposals to combat COVID unemployment fraud by strengthening program integrity and putting stronger measures in place as part of the eligibility process up front to protect Americans. Our proposal would emphasize identity verification and validation and increase state capacity to put in place digital identity proofing services. We need to make sure people are who they say they are before we give out the benefits. It also includes a focus on recoupment and recovery of fraudulently paid dollars by clawing back dollars from the very criminals and increasing capacity for prosecution. This problem of unemployment fraud has created an added burden that is placing undue stress on thousands of Americans when they can least afford it. Look forward to hearing from our guests today to help us find solutions. It is time to act. With that, I'd like to introduce my guests. Following their remarks, I will turn to each of my colleagues in order to make sure everyone has a chance to participate. I'm asking that remarks be limited to 5 minutes. First of all, I would like to welcome Doug Swetnam, Pete Eskew, and Eva Velasquez for your participation. Doug Swetnam is the Section Chief for Data Privacy and Identity Theft Unit for the Indiana Attorney General. He also serves as the acting chair of the Indiana Executive Cybersecurity Council Legal and Insurance Working Group. Prior to joining the Office of Indiana Attorney General, he worked for a series of Fortune 500 companies in law and technology roles. Pete Eskew is Senior Vice President at ID.me. He oversees the public sector division that supports over 7.5 million identity verifications for the Social Security Administration, Department of Veteran Affairs, Department of Treasury, and 26 workforce agencies. He began his career as a assistant for Representative John Boehner, Speaker of the House, and has spent the last decade working in information technology. Eva Velasquez is President and CEO of the Identity Theft Resource Center. Ms. Velasquez is recognized as a national fraud and identity theft expert, been featured on numerous news outlets. Ms. Velasquez previously served as the Vice President of Operations for the San Diego Better Business Bureau and spent 21 years at the San Diego District Attorney's Office. Mr. Swetnam, we'll start with you. I have to unmute.
Thank you, Ranking Member and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this virtual roundtable event. My name is Doug Swetnam. I'm the Section Chief for Data Privacy in the Identity Theft Unit for the Indiana Attorney General Todd Rokita. My section handles a variety of scams and frauds, including identity theft. Even before the pandemic struck, identity theft was considered one of, if not the fastest growing crimes in the United States. A decades-long string of data breaches has exposed American consumers' sensitive financial information to criminals around the world. Consumers' full profile information, including name, address, date of birth, social security numbers, and even their credit scores, now sell for mere pennies on the dark web. Identity thieves are as clever as they are ruthless. They gobble up that information and they use it as a tool, purposefully targeting the elderly, the infirm, the weak, and the financially desperate. COVID-19 and the response to it created an unparalleled situation unlike anything we've seen. Millions of Americans suddenly and unexpectedly found themselves out of work, and even those who were fortunate enough to keep a job were displaced from their offices and normal routines as they were forced to work remotely. The relief that was directed to Americans in need added billions of dollars to our unemployment insurance system, covering many who would have been ineligible for traditional unemployment benefits. The self-employed, independent contractors, and part-time gig workers. The billions of dollars pumped into a previously non-existent distribution system created a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for every scammer, fraudster, and thief in the world. And they've jumped at the chance to take advantage of that opportunity. In Indiana, my section experienced a 1,500% increase in identity theft-related fraud reports in 2020. We are on track to set a new record for 2021. In our experience, consumers learn of the identity theft related unemployment fraud in a variety of ways. Some learn when they attempt to apply for unemployment insurance benefits that they need, only to be told someone else beat them to it. Some are notified by their employer, who obviously knows that they're still employed. Some receive prepaid credit cards in the mail, often from states where they don't live. And others only learn they've been victims when they receive a 1099 in the mail for benefits they know they didn't receive. Worst of all, we believe that many victims still don't know they've been victimized. They've yet to learn that fact. I welcome the opportunity to answer any questions today and contribute to this body's understanding of what I think is a very serious problem. And with that, I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Swetnam. Mr. Eskew, you may proceed.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Thank you, members of the committee. It's good to be here today. Thought I'd introduce ID.me. ID.me is the only credential service provider certified at NIST 863-2 as well as 63-3 in accordance with GSA's FICAM trust framework. What that means is we're the identity verification company and login trusted by the VA, Social Security Administration, Department of Treasury, IRS, as well as 100 plus private companies. Now, why we're here today is that we're serving 23 states currently, with 3 more set to come in the coming days. We started our work with the state of Florida on June 29th of last year and have seen this acceleration of growth up until today. Thus far, we've verified over 4.4 million Americans looking to claim benefits for UI and PUA, and we're adding about 1.5 million Americans every month. Simultaneously, due to our controls, we've stopped about 1.6 million fraudulent claims, protecting over $30 billion of taxpayer money, according to our data. And don't just take my word for it. Governors and employees at California, Colorado, and New York have all stated this publicly. How do we do it? As noted above, we built our company and our gateway product to adhere to the NIST 863-3 standards, which were designed to prevent remote and scalable attacks. Today, we offer two primary ways to verify one's identity. One is an unsupervised pathway, in essence, just going through a website and ensuring that you have the proper documentation. And then the second one would be our supervised, or our No Identity Left Behind initiative, which is really part of our ethos and consistent with our founding. As a former military officer that founded our company with the No Identity Left Behind, it's really tied to No Man Left Behind. So as the name suggests, ID.me virtualizes an in-person visit to a government office so the applicant can verify their identity remotely through a recorded video chat session with a trained agent designed to help people that are not in credit records, may not have access to other documentation. We also catch a lot of fraudsters that are brazen enough to go on camera and try and commit fraud live in front of us. We have seen a surge in spikes related to our brand on the dark web really since March of 2021. And we know it's working because some of the most popular search strings have been No ID Me. Where can I find a state that does not utilize ID Me? We launched with New York State about a month ago, and the posts mentioning New York State and unemployment decreased about 35%. Simultaneously, the state of Ohio that does not use ID Me saw an increase of about 75% in search strings related to their unemployment programs. We're seeing fraud in three different types, as my predecessor just spoke about. The most common, of course, is ID theft. You know, all of our information is available on the dark web, whether from one of the breaches like Equifax or the OPM breach, Anthem Healthcare back in 2015. Social engineering has spiked. You're seeing about 10% of people try and engage in social engineering, trying to dupe a legitimate individual and giving over their identity. Really heartbreaking scams, romance scams, job scams, prize money. We have video evidence of all of this occurring. Digital impersonation is another component here, where people are pretending to be employees at state workforce administrations, pretending to be employees at Bank of America or somewhere else to grab the identity, to grab credentials of a legitimate American. We're also seeing masks or physical impersonation, where people come on camera or take a selfie of themselves with not their face. It's important to note that traditional ID verification cannot prevent these scams. So who is committing this crime? As the ranking member stated, organized crime across the country, international and domestic. Some of the countries that we would expect, like Russia, Uzbekistan, China, Nigeria, etc., but also a lot of domestic organized crime is beginning to get into this game as well. There's lots of victims, of course, individuals who have their ID stolen, cannot apply for benefits if you're the second person applying in your name. You have to work with the government to gain access back to your ID. And of course, you may be paying taxes. Also, people that are trying to get through, that are struggling with technology, they are beholden to these systems, and they are also waiting to get through and might have to struggle a little longer. Of course, taxpayers are footing the bill for a lot of this. We have recommendations, of course, and we're looking to speak to those. A portable and trusted identity must underpin all consumer financial transactions. The prior controls are no longer good enough. And why penalize people that are playing by the rules? The end goal is to increase access by empowering individuals to control their own login and verified identity and make it portable. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thanks so much, Mr. Eskew. Ms. Velasquez, you are next. You may proceed.
Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. For those of you who are not familiar with the Identity Theft Resource Center, we're a national nonprofit established over 20 years ago with the vision to empower and guide all stakeholders to minimize their risk and mitigate the impact of identity crimes and compromise. And our vision involves reducing the victimization rate and helping victims recover. The most important part of that recovery process is the direct one-on-one victim services. And last year, we provided those one-on-one services to about 11,000 individuals through multiple channels, our contact center, live chat, and over 1 million people used our web-based self-help information center. We have referral partnerships with numerous organizations, law enforcement entities, all the 211s, even the Federal Trade Commission. In fact, we handled over 21,000 referrals since that referral relationship has began. And our instances of service increased significantly last year. We had a 40% increase in the total number of contacts into our contact center, and the case type shifted. This is really unusual, but government identity theft was the most prevalent last year, and that trend is continuing into this year. The most notable increase was, in fact, in unemployment identity theft. That is what is continuing to drive contacts into our center. We saw a 4,800% increase. I'm not misspeaking. That's a 4,800% increase in just that case type. And we're on pace to surpass our 2020 numbers before the end of the second quarter this year. I think this is really notable because a lot of the news coverage I'm seeing and just the discussions I'm hearing around this issue, as if unemployment identity theft is in the past. It was last year's problem, it's died down or we fixed it, and that is just not what we're seeing. If anything, we're seeing it increase. And I'd really like to close by humanizing the data behind all of this, because there is a person whose life is being adversely impacted. We know this at the ITRC because we conduct an aftermath study every year. We ask the people that we helped in a previous year, we ask them more than just how much time did you spend and how much money did you lose. That's important, but it's not the full picture. Our aftermath report this year, along with a special pandemic supplemental report, will be released later this month. Victims of unemployment and stimulus-related identity fraud, these are the people most in need of those relief dollars, are suffering a cascading effect due to their victimization. 33% of the victims we surveyed reported that they did not have enough money to buy food or pay for utilities. 13% have stated that they've been unable to get temporary or permanent jobs as a result of the misuse of their identity. Think about those lost opportunity costs. And so many of the victims at the time that we surveyed them told us that the issue was still not resolved. I'm urging everyone that I speak with when they're considering where to put resources to please not forget about the importance of that free direct victim assistance and support. It's a critical piece of the long-term recovery for these folks. And without that support, free victim services like those provided by the ITRC and others, they'll be reduced or either disappear. So I just encourage everyone not to get too lost in the data. That's very important. But behind each of those data points, there is a person, and please let's all keep their plight top of mind. Of course, if anyone would like more information about our reports, you can certainly reach out to us, but those will be published in just a few short weeks. And with that, I open it up to questions.
Thanks, Ms. Velasquez. We'll hold the questions till the end, and I would now recognize my colleague, the gentleman from California, Mr. Nunez.
Jackie, thank you so much for putting this on. I appreciate it. This is what we have to do to try to get good testimony for the record and to try to build that testimony to hopefully we'll be able to get the majority back and make some of these improvements for fraud, because as we all know that are on this call today and all the folks testifying, it's getting harder and harder for people to find employees today. I know that even in California, as we lost population for the first time in history of the state of California in 2020, we still can't find employees. So I know you've been working hard on this, and look forward to listening to the rest of the questions the members are going to ask. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thanks. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Buchanan. Mr. Buchanan?
Yeah, there we go.
There you
thank
go.
you for recognizing me, Congresswoman. I want to commend you for your leadership for hosting this important roundtable today. Government fraud of any kind, including fraudulent applications for unemployment benefit, is totally unacceptable. It's pretty shocking to me when you take a look at $65 billion in unemployment. I think the young lady said something about 4,800% increase. That's pretty shocking. But I also think about Medicare. That number was close to 65 billion. For somebody that's been in business for 30 years before I got in this crazy business, I can't imagine anybody losing that kind of money if it was run by a company or anything else. You'd be out of business. I mean, it's sickening. And the other thought is as we pump so many dollars we're trying to put through the system, I can't imagine we have anything close to the infrastructure to take care of that. Let me ask the witnesses, Mr. Swigden and some of the others, you guys.
Hey, Vern, can I stop you 1 second? We're going to get to the questions at the end. Just so everybody has a chance to bring on their guests.
Oh, okay. Okay, that'd be good. I have my questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. Thanks. I'd like to recognize now the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Adrian Smith, and his guest.
Thank you, Jackie. Appreciate this very timely discussion here. Today, my guest is Amy Simon. Amy served as the Chief of Staff and Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Labor's Employment and Training Administration during the previous administration. So grateful to have Amy. Amy is fortunate that a fraudulent application in her name was never approved, but perhaps she can offer us some insight on that front as well. Amy, thanks for being here. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Congressman Smith and Ranking Member Walorski. It's my privilege to be here today. So, yes, my story is a bit different. I was at the Department of Labor during the previous administration as the COVID pandemic was unfolding. And so I was on the front lines of our daily inundation of both claims and fraud. After the CARES Act was passed, the unemployment insurance system became a rich target in a way that it had never been previously. Understandably, many states were unprepared to defend themselves against organized crime, against credential stuffing, and while they were trying to set up new programs and grapple with record-setting volume. We worked to give states the resources and regulatory help that they needed to prevent fraud. But at the end of the day, the unemployment insurance system has 53 front doors. Each state is responsible to make its own IT investments, whether that's in staff or technology. I think the system requires particular attention to be able to move as a coordinated whole. And I believe that there are some law enforcement and policy improvements that could enable the system to be able to do that. However, the topic got slightly more personal for me after I left the department. On April 5th of this year, I was notified by automated text that I had filed an application for unemployment insurance in a state that I had not lived in for 4 years, and a place in which I had never filed a UI claim. Needless to say, it was an unsettling reality to accept that not only had I watched fraud unfold on the macro stage, it was now impacting my life directly. Later the same day, the state in question had to take down their initial claim application portal due to the volume of fraudulent attacks. I, in fact, though, was one of the lucky ones. I knew where to file a fraud report. I knew how to contact the regional administrator to ensure that the state was aware that this was happening. I didn't have benefits diverted to someone else's bank account. I didn't get surprised by a 1099-G showing up and finding out that someone had gotten benefits in my name. I'm not stuck in an endless paperwork battle trying to prove that it wasn't me. But being one of the lucky ones in this sense isn't really, really that lucky. And so at the end of the day, eliminating UI fraud is going to take concerted, ongoing partnership. There is a role for policy changes, technology changes, and enforcement. Congress, the executive branch, governors, state UI offices, and law enforcement all have critical roles to play. Today is an important part of that process, and I appreciate the opportunity to contribute. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to recognize a gentleman from New York, Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed. We'll come back to Mr. Reed. Now I'd like to turn over to Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Ms. Walorski. Almost 5 years ago, we actually had a discussion amongst Republicans and Ways and Means in regards to technology that could deal with earned income tax credit fraud. My impression is if we had implemented some of those verification systems, we would actually have a plug and play type of mechanic that could have stepped in and dealt with this astonishing number of fraud. As the hearing goes on, I desperately hope the witnesses will talk about the technology that can solve much of this problem and how quickly it can be captured and implemented. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Dr. Winstrup. Dr. Winstrup?
Yeah, sorry, I had to unmute there. It came up sooner than I thought. But I want to thank you, Jackie, Representative Walorski, and my friend. Thank you for putting this together today. And I'm looking forward to hearing directly from so many of the folks on these front lines of this issue. Very concerned about the rampant unemployment fraud. Obviously, it's had a huge impact in Ohio. I led a letter with a number of my colleagues on Ways and Means asking for action to address this issue that we're seeing so many Americans face with, and so many taxpayers across the country have received a 1099-G form indicating the amount of unemployment benefits they received in 2020, and many of them did not receive those benefits. So it's been very difficult. It's making a considerable amount of chaos for the IRS. And so I plan to introduce a bill this week to hold the folks that have been victims of this harmless and collect data on the amount of overpayments waived due to suspected or confirmed fraud. So I want to introduce my guest today, Mike Rogers. The Ohio Attorney General's office has been dealing with the 1099-G issue, as well as tackling an unprecedented amount of fraud. And that's why I invited Mike Rogers. He's the Director of Policy and Legislation for Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost. And I'll let Mike take it from here to discuss Ohio's experience and how the AG's office has worked with state and federal partners to respond to these fraud threats and the problem that we face. Go ahead, Mike. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Congressman Winstrup and Ranking Member Walorski. In Ohio, the Attorney General's office, we had kind of a unique view of the fraud that was being perpetrated both in Ohio and across the country. We started hearing from constituents early on about some concerns that were propping up related to identity theft and others. And we very early on had to work with the Ohio Department of Jobs and Family Services as the agency in Ohio who administers the unemployment benefits program to try to figure out what was going on and what types of claims rightfully belonged with our office as legitimate fraud, and what types of claims needed to be resolved directly through the Jobs and Family Services offices related to unemployment benefits. And I think our concern primarily was with the constituents who were receiving the 1099-G forms that had not applied for unemployment benefits. And the concern was if somebody is going to receive something like this, and this is the first indication that there may be an indicia of fraud, we wanted to try to reassure folks as quickly as possible that the state was aware of these issues, that our partners at the federal level were aware of the levels of fraud, and that we were actively working to untangle those problems at the state level before bad information in the form of 1099-Gs was transmitted to the federal government at the IRS, and then causing problems at the federal level as well. So very thankful for Congressman Winstrup, Congressman Stivers, and several other members of Congress for the letter that they sent to the Department of Treasury and the Department of Labor asking the federal government for guidance about what to do with these 1099-Gs if there was a suspicion of fraud. Because again, our concern was we wanted to have time to figure out where the fraud was at the state level and untangle it before transmitting that bad information to the federal government. And I think we've seen some progress in those areas with some guidance about delaying the issuance of 1099 to the federal government that we think has been productive thus far.
Thank you. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington. Mr.
Hey,
Arrington?
Jackie, can you hear me
Hey there.
okay?
You bet.
Representative Walorski, thanks again for hosting this important roundtable. $60+ billion is tragic, absolutely tragic and unacceptable. I'm anxious to hear from the witnesses who is accountable. You know, is it the state? Is it the federal government? Is it a particular office? Who's at the head of that office? I think too often in the federal government and in situations like this, many are accountable, which means no one is really accountable. I'm also interested in hearing about best practices. In Texas, we had over 600,000 cases of fraud to date. And I think the total is somewhere above $700 million worth in terms of dollar value. So I'm again interested to know who's accountable, what incentives are in place. Vern made a good point. In business, this would never happen. Your shareholders would revolt. You'd be fired. You know, there'd be a whole new management team put in. But I'm not sure we know who to hold accountable here. But we ought to have incentives, both carrots and sticks, to make sure that these types of things don't happen across the board. But in this case, 6.
Thanks, Jody. Thanks, Jody. We probably froze there, but I'm going to move on. Thanks. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes, and his guest.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Walorski. I want to thank you for holding this important roundtable. You know, as many Kansans in my district suffer from unemployment due to no fault of their own, they've struggled to receive the benefits and even talk to a live person at the Kansas Department of Labor. And still today, I hear from constituents who have not received the unemployment they rightly deserve. What makes this even worse is that while thousands of Kansans have spent hours and days trying to get a hold of someone at the Kansas Department of Labor, millions of dollars in fraudulent claims are being successfully processed. Criminals took advantage of this crisis and hurt hardworking Kansans in the process. We know this has happened across the country as the U.S. Department of Labor has estimated more than $63 billion in unemployment benefits have been improperly paid. Excuse me. Today, I'm pleased to introduce an authority on unemployment fraud in Kansas, State Representative Sean Tarwater. Representative Tarwater chairs the Kansas House Committee on Commerce, Labor, and Economic Development. He serves in the state legislature since 2017, and he's a small business owner who's active in his church and community. Representative Tarwater, can you tell us what you've seen regarding unemployment fraud in Kansas?
Yes, sir. Thank you, and thank you, Ranking Member Walorski, and thank you to Congressman Estes for allowing me this opportunity. I've already learned a little bit today, and I look forward to seeing what your report ends up being. Kansas is well behind the curve as far as modernization goes, but we're working on it. In addition to being the chairman of the House Commerce Committee, I also vice chaired a joint committee on economic revitalization over the summertime, starting in late spring. And that's when our work really began on trying to uncover what was wrong with the unemployment system in Kansas. As far as fraud goes, we identified it very early. The governor of Kansas was one of the first to close the entire state for businesses. That happened in March. And that was despite the fact that most counties had no cases. Middle of the country, and one size fits all happened here. And so she shut down the entire state, and it was well over a month for most areas. And as a result, our UI spiked tremendously. Kansas was lucky, one of the lucky states. We were in a good spot at that point. We had over $1.2 billion in our unemployment trust fund. and we have less than 3 million people in the state. So we were in a really good position. However, like many other states in our nation, our system was antiquated. We don't have any cross checks. We still really don't. Charge statements are issued only once a year, and the claim statements were delayed by several weeks, which made it so that the employers weren't able to report the fraud in time to be paid, not to be paid. As a result, we were extremely vulnerable. We documented over 40 different times that our Department of Labor, the Kansas Department of Labor, was notified, directed and informed about amassing concerns regarding unemployment fraud. UDOT, the federal government, offered several different times, May 11th and the 19th, as far as fraud alerts and what to do about it. But in all the U-polls that you sent, you held us harmless, and you said that we would not be held harmless for any claims paid that shouldn't have been paid. And as a direct result of that, I think that, our government didn't care either. They didn't care because the U.S. Department of Labor didn't seem to care. Wasn't until, I guess, even in September of 2020, not only did you warn us of fraud, you gave us the software or suggested the software that could fix it, and you funded us by $1.8 million. Our governor did not put those in place until late January, early February. It took 3 days to install that software, and it did cost the $1.8 million that you gave us. And at that point, the fraud seemed to stop, it seemed to fix. It's unfortunate that she waited until that $1.2 billion was almost gone, along with all the other unemployment funds that came in during that time. The worst part of this, I think, was the lack of transparency from the administration. The joint committee that I spoke of earlier pummeled the DOL with questions constantly, every time they were before us, and never had an answer. They were very vague with their answers, and it was almost like they were hiding something. Their answer, as far as the fraud, that was our biggest concern. Their answer about the fraud was the big money was behind the federal funds, and that's what was being targeted, and we were held harmless, so they didn't seem like they wanted to address it until had to. Bottom line is that they didn't care. Early in the process, we identified a loophole in the system where when you went to our system and you typed in a social security number, the first thing you did was type in your social security number. And when you did that, it would self-populate the rest of the information. We realized this because a young lady called in concerned that she typed in an improper social security number and it self-populated with someone else's information. We brought this to the DOL's attention. They denied it, and they said that it was not a big deal, probably didn't happen, and if it did, it was a one-off situation. But we do have video of this happening, and after we put the stops in on late January, early December, or early February, they then said that they stopped over 1 million bots in one day. It's our contention that those 1 million bots were firing social security numbers at that page, and when it populated, they got one right. So it self-populated. That is ID theft, and that is at the fault of our Department of Labor, and that's my biggest concern. Kansas had an 1,800% increase in the rate of reporting identification fraud or identification theft, and that's ranked #1 in the nation. And so we draw. It doesn't take long to draw a straight line between the two.
Thanks so much for sharing, and I'd like to recognize now the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Ferguson.
Thank you, and Representative Walorski, thank you for hosting this hearing, and to all of the guests, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to spend some time with us today. I, like everyone else, am shocked at the amount of fraud that we're hearing about. I'm going to hold most of my comments, though, for the Q&A session. But I was particularly curious, and when it comes time to for our guest to continue to speaking from Mr. Eskew's point of view, talking about the ID requirements in New York versus Ohio and the increase and decrease in fraud associated with that. So I'd like to come back with some questions on that. So with that, I will yield back.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn, and his guest. Mr. Hearn.
Thank you. Thank you so much for holding this meeting today, Jackie. It's so important for, as Vernon mentioned, being in business for as long as I have. It's very troubling to see what our small businesses have to deal with in trying to fight this battle. You know, the April jobs report came out last week, and as we know, the numbers were abysmal compared to what everybody was projecting. And yet, you know, as the unemployment rose, this is going to create more problems. I'm beyond upset with these results, but unfortunately not surprised. When you pay people more to stay home rather than work, they're going to do just that. I've said that a number of times for almost a year now. I've talked to business owners across our state, across our country, and they're all begging for the government just to simply get out of the way so they can get back to normal. And there was a real need for targeted intentional relief for unemployed individuals last year. However, the excitement Democrats felt over spending limitless taxpayer money left us with this rampant, unchecked unemployment fraud. And very shortly after Congress began doling out trillion-dollar spending packages, employed Americans began receiving notifications that their Social Security numbers and private information had been used to file for unemployment. The Department of Labor estimates that more than $63 billion have been sent to criminals and international crime rings. That is $63 billion that the U.S. government stole from hardworking Americans' paychecks and gave to criminals. To demonstrate the unnerving feeling of criminals gaming the U.S. government by utilizing individuals' private information, I've invited Jared Colley from Tulsa, Oklahoma, to bear witness for us today. Jared is the general counsel for the Bama Companies, a company that makes baked goods for restaurants. And Jared, could you share with us what you experienced?
Thank you, Ranking Member Walorski and members of the subcommittee. I'm privileged to speak to you today on behalf of myself, our owner and CEO, Ms. Paula Marshall, and the awesome team members at Bama. I would especially like to thank Mr. Hearn for his invitation to speak to the subcommittee today as his guest. The Bama Companies, Inc. has been in business since 1927. Our company mission of helping people be successful through caring and accountability was instilled upon our company culture by our wonderful owner and CEO, Paula Marshall. We carry this culture throughout our multiple facilities as well as throughout our communities. As we all know, the COVID pandemic made unemployment benefit assistance vital to so many people throughout the country over the past year. Such assistance fits in well with our company mission. However, as many of you also know, there are individuals who are taking unlawful advantage of this program. Over the past year, we've had approximately 30 fraudulent unemployment cases, 8 of which occurred just this past Friday. For Bama, the fraud cases have fallen into 2 primary categories: fraud attempts using the personal information of current Bama team members, and fraud attempts using fake team member names while claiming to be former team members of Bama. The majority of the cases we've seen have fallen into this latter category. However, I myself was a victim of the fraud committed against current team members. Such fraud is creating an undue burden upon employers who now have to spend valuable time sorting through and verifying numerous fraudulent claims. Such fraud is also creating an undue burden upon unemployed workers. Their personal information is being stolen, and it is causing unfortunate delays in the processing of their benefits. One former Bama team member has still not received his benefits after having applied nearly 9 months ago. We greatly appreciate the time the committee is taking to review this issue. As employers and employees, we stand ready to assist you in whatever ways we can in order to eliminate these fraud attempts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I'd like to recognize a gentlewoman from West Virginia, Ms. Miller.
Good morning, and thank you, Ranking Member Walorski, for this opportunity for all of us to talk about the devastating effect of the fraud from the COVID unemployment programs. It's a huge problem in my country, in my state, as well as all over the country. Workforce West Virginia is continuing to receive tens of thousands of fraudulent claims for unemployment benefits. The agency recently issued an ID theft warning after mailing 1099-Gs to nearly 200,000 individuals who received regular state unemployment benefits pandemic emergency unemployment compensation, federal pandemic unemployment compensation, and lost wage assistance. For many people, this may be the first time they receive notice that the state actually has had fraudulent unemployment benefits issued, against their name. First, I want to thank Ms. Bickler for participating today. We're really pleased that she took the time off from her job just to share her story. She's a native of Greenbrier County. Leslie Bixler is currently the Vice President of Human Resources at the West Virginia School of Osteopathic Medicine. It's in Lewisburg, West Virginia, which she has been in since 2005. Leslie and her husband, Doug, and their 3 children live on their family farm in Lewisburg, where in addition to being small business owners, they are all active in their community and in the state. I'd like to give Leslie the opportunity to speak how identity theft has affected her life, her family, and many of the employees of the West Virginia School of Osteopathic Medicine. Thank you, Ms. Bixler.
Thank you, Congresswoman Miller. When your identity is stolen, it is so frustrating, and I have often felt helpless against these attacks. My nightmare began in July 2020 when I received a credit card from the Arizona Department of Economic Services. I immediately called and canceled the card and reported the fraud to the state of Arizona. Now I realize the system is totally automated and there was never any receipt or acknowledgement of my report. I kept my documentation but didn't check my credit or place a freeze on it. In August 2020, I received a KeyBank credit card. It was not clear who issued the card, so I called the credit card company first and reported the fraud. At that time, I discovered it was West Virginia Unemployment. Then I contacted Workforce West Virginia and my payroll department to report the fraud. Next came an Exxon gas card in October, and then the big one, a pandemic disaster loan from the Small Business Administration for over $8,000. This was really significant because the loan had already been issued when I received notice. Finally, I got smart. I reviewed my credit report, reported to the Federal Trade Commission, put a fraud alert in place. Should anyone try to borrow money or get a credit card under my information, they must confirm my identity. I filed a police report, and I checked with the Social Security Administration. Now, I feel like I'm a relatively intelligent person, and I still had to call my sister, who was a former consumer rights litigator, to get through all of these steps. I wish I could say that that fixed everything, but my second fraudulent West Virginia unemployment claim occurred in February 2021. And then first thing this weekend on Saturday morning, my bank credit card was compromised for $67.45 at bulbs.com. And that SBA investigation, still not resolved, still impacting my credit report. I've spent hours working to recover my identity, and unfortunately, I'm not alone. 62 employees, or 21% of our employees at the West Virginia School of Osteopathic Medicine, have also been victims of unemployment fraud. In fact, 14 have had 2 and 5 have had 3 fraudulent unemployment claims. In the last week, 2 weeks, WVS employees have had 10 new claims. The last one came on Friday. These problems are so widespread that my HR colleagues across the state, WVU, Marshall, Shepherd, the community colleges, the list goes on, each of us working to assist our employees by developing resources and connecting them to resources that will help them. Unfortunately, scores of employees, both public and private across West Virginia, have been and continue to be victims of unemployment fraud. The one good thing that has come from this is that we've built a relationship with the fraud investigators at Workforce West Virginia. My understanding is that in the last year they had about 10,000 fraudulent claims. Last month, 20,000. As employers, we are working to get good information to our employees about how they can protect themselves, and we're working with Workforce West Virginia to stop these fraudulent claims. But it's like a game of whack-a-mole. The hits keep coming with no end in sight. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I just want to thank you so much. Thanks, Representative Miller and Leslie. I just want to thank all of our guests for coming and sharing all that information about what's happening. Obviously, it's happening around the country. We appreciate your expertise. And I wanted to quickly transition to this question period. So if I'm going to start back in that same order that we started before, I will take a second here and address my question to Mr. Swetnam. My question is for you. As I stated in my opening, we are working proposals to fight back against fraud in these programs. Are there any specific recommendations you can give based on your experience in Indiana?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing that we need to do is to put the prevention systems in place. So ID.me is a good example of a system, but the automated verification systems, because it is much easier to stop the fraud before it happens than to try to chase it down and claw it back. So most states did not have systems set up for a lot of the pieces of the CARES Act, and ours included, and they just weren't ready for the kind of onslaught that they had in fraudsters from all over the place. And some of the things that these prevention systems can do, for instance, they'll look at the IP address of the applicant to see that it makes sense or it matches the people who are supposedly signing up. If the person is supposed to be from Indiana and the IP address shows Nigeria, that's a good clue that there's a problem. Similarly, what we have seen is an awful lot of the information used on these fraudulent claims is dated. And that's because we believe it's coming from the data breaches. And so we will see things like the application being in someone's maiden name rather than married name because the information was a few years old. And these are things that prevention systems can spot and stop before the transaction completes.
Thank you. And to the rest of my colleagues, if you don't have questions or have comments, feel free, whatever it is you want to address to all the guests that are here today. So I'd like to recognize a gentleman from Florida, Mr. Buchanan.
Thank you, Jackie. I also want to thank all of our witnesses for taking their time out. Let me just say out front, just before I get into questions, I can just tell you Florida's at full employment. We don't have workers. In fact, my good friend Kevin, we have McDonald's in our area where basically they can open the window. They can't open the restaurant. It's really tragic what's going on. I've never seen it in my 40 years business, 30 years before I got in this business, but in the congressional business. But the bottom line, it's really frightening to see with a lot of our businesses, they can't pick up the trash or anything else. So it's a big issue, and that's why this unemployment discussion today is so important. I want to ask a question of both Mr. Sweden and Mr. Rogers, both of you who work for the Attorney General. Your offices are on the front line of law enforcement activities. Just to better understand this massive fraud that goes on, not just with unemployment, but with everything else, how much of it's organizations or individuals in your states that's creating it? How much of it, if you know, is out of state, but they're involved in Indiana or Ohio? And how much of it's international groups? I mean, these numbers are so gigantic. 65 billion for this. Stimulus, I'm sure it's billions. Unemployment, Medicare, 65, 70 billion. I mean, it's frightening to see what's going on. But yet you could take credit card companies and others that I'm sure maybe the fraud or the abuse is 1%, 1.5%. This is 10% or above. So, gentlemen, what's your thoughts? What do you see? What's your sense of where this is coming from? Is it state-driven organizations? Or is it out of state, or is it international? And we'll start with you, Mr. Rogers, first.
Thank you. I think what we're seeing in Ohio is a lot of the fraud, particularly when you're talking about the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, is coming from overseas and out of state. And I think that's very different. The type of fraud we're seeing in that program is different than the type of fraud we typically see in the normal unemployment system. And I think that's what's made this issue challenging for the states to kind of handle is typically when you're seeing fraud in the normal unemployment benefits system, It's someone who's overreported their income, or they've done something that in their application that's not correct, and that's typically what we're used to dealing with. And now you're talking about a situation with the PUA program where we've got complicated criminal elements that are gaming the system, and they're gaming the system just in order essentially to steal money. It's a very different issue than I think than we're used to dealing with in the traditional unemployment system.
Mr. Swede, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that in Indiana, we've seen a very similar phenomenon that the vast majority is coming from out of state. They appear to be fairly organized out of state. And we see a fair amount that's coming from international sources, some of which we've been able to trace back to countries that we see in a lot of the online theft and scams, Nigeria and Jamaica and the former Soviet countries. So we see quite a bit of that. We don't see that much that is within the state, and the fraud that we do see is more of the traditional, not really identity theft, but kind of traditional fraud where they're just reporting information that's inaccurate, but not necessarily stealing someone's identity.
And let me ask both of you, just in terms of enforcement, the Biden administration, they're suggesting another $6 trillion. I don't think we even begin to have any kind of infrastructure for those kind of dollars. That's why it's very easy for the fraudsters. But is the administration, are they doing their fair share, or what they should be doing, leading on this, putting this kind of money out in the marketplace in Ohio and different places where I don't think we have the infrastructure? I can't imagine, nobody can imagine $1 trillion, but his proposal, first 100 days, is another $6 trillion. What's your thought about the administration and their effort? Are they providing the level of support you think that is necessary to stem some of the fraud? Mr. Sweden, go ahead.
Yeah, and we have an identity theft task force that was organized and led by the FBI, but what we've seen is it's been fairly overwhelmed. The Department of Labor has made an effort, and the individual FBI agents have made an effort, but by and large, they've been unable to keep up with the volume of fraud cases. And we are finding when we offer, are there places we can send our fraud cases? The answer is no, we don't have any capacity. We're not able to deal with them. So it's a real problem. There just aren't enough law enforcement resources in place to pursue all these fraud cases.
Yeah, Mr. Rogers, anything you want to add to that in terms of Ohio?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that, obviously folks have looked to our office for enforcement, criminal enforcement of the laws that have been broken. And what we've had to tell them is that the Department of Justice is largely in the lead on the criminal side of any enforcement efforts. And while we're willing and able to try to assist them with information that we're gathering here in Ohio, obviously the states really aren't equipped to deal with fraud on an international basis and dealing with criminal elements. And so we're really looking to the Department of Justice on those issues to try to go after those monies that have been stolen.
So the international fraud, let me just conclude with this, Mr. Rogers. The international fraud, do you feel like the administration is doing enough about that? Because that's frightening if they're in Ohio and they're not being aggressive about enforcement or looking for the bad guys.
The only thing I would say is there hasn't been a lot of information about any indictments being handed down, any arrests or anything like that. I'm aware that I think for the first time a few weeks ago, there was finally some information about a few cases that were being brought. But again, my sense is that the scope of the fraud is so overwhelming. It's really hard. It's been difficult for law enforcement to even get their hands on it at this point.
Thank you both, and I yield back.
Thank you so much. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert?
Thank you, Jackie. I have a couple different questions, but first, let me tell a quick story. About 3-4 months ago, my wife walks in, back home with a unemployment claim for herself under a maiden name that she had not had for 20 years, for the business she runs. So it gives you a sense the scale that's out there. She's now had more fraudulent unemployment claims to her business than she actually has employees. And I know we have a tendency to want to talk about the law enforcement side of this, but my immediate passion is there a quick, robust technology solution that we could adopt to at least stop the hemorrhaging? So to the witnesses we have, what is the fastest thing that could be done on a technology platform to stop obvious fraud that's hitting our state unemployment offices, like in my wife's case, where one shows up to the place she's still managing, she's still employed under a maiden name? A data system should have caught that immediately. What do we adopt? What do we do here?
Sure, I can take that one, Pete Eskew here for ID.me. I think first you have to deploy best-in-breed technology that adheres to federal standards. So ID.me is built on the NIST 863-3 standards that forces applicants to have all of the evidence in their material and in their hand in order to pass a test. They have to have a cell phone that they've been paying the bill for months. They have to have the face of the applicant to pass a biometric test. You can't do that if you aren't that individual. You also have to work with additional companies such as cell phone carriers and other telecom carriers to ensure that they are not putting out recycled phone numbers out there. This is a huge problem that we're seeing, that a lot of dark web thieves are able to buy the bundle of identity, but they're also able to buy a previous phone number and attach it. And thus, they're very creative with that. So we need a robust solution.
May I ask you a question? Because a few years ago, we actually had a presentation of a consumer data company that basically said, if you ask for an earned income tax credit, we could instantly bounce your attributes. Hey, we know you made this much money because you had this sort of consumption. We have this recent address. We have those sorts of things. You could do a go, no go tag within a fraction of a second. Isn't that a much more efficient, at least a quick first siphon, or in this case, strainer type of data set? Is there something that can be adopted that would go very fast that also wouldn't create a backup in these unemployment systems in the different states?
Sure. We went live with the state of Florida in under 3 days. They called us and said, we have a major problem. We deployed our solution, took us 3 days to get going. Now, I would say the traditional methods, and Mr. Ferguson was asking this question about the state of Ohio and other methods, they rely on knowledge-based questions, and I will tell you that that is not sufficient. So identity thieves know the answers to all of the questions that we are asking or answering already. What is your wife's maiden name? Where did you grow up? What's your high school mascot? Those are no longer sufficient to block identity thieves and need to be going away immediately. So I think that that's something you can deploy quickly, but I would caution you against deploying something with the knowledge-based question that has been adopted en masse. I would go with a different route to adhere to the NIST standards that say that is no longer the right way to approach this problem.
Thank you, Jackie, and I will yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Dr. Winstrup.
Thanks again, Jackie, and again, thanks all of you for being here. This is a very perplexing problem, obviously, the idea of fraud itself. I've been sort of an ancillary victim, if you will, where people take pictures of me and my family and create fake Facebook pages, talk about being a surgeon, being in the military. Sometimes they use my name, sometimes they don't. Probably caught these about 15 times. Not that I was looking, but it eventually comes back to us. and sometimes they get on dating lines, and again, it's a whole fake scenario, and then they get people to unfortunately send them money. And it turns out it was somewhere out of Africa and possibly some links in Atlanta. I mean, so this stuff is very, very sophisticated, as we're finding out and hearing about. So I guess, Mike, you've heard some of the things that Pete has had to say, and obviously I have an interest in Ohio specifically, and I know you've been working so hard on this. So what do you think is missing? Because even in some of these fraud cases, one was on some type of a deal, and they actually had my face on a passport and on a driver's license, California driver's license, that looked completely real. So it really gets challenging. So, Mike, what's missing for you, do you think? And then Pete, maybe you weigh in on that, like you have a little bit there. Do you want to go first, Mike?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman Winstrup, and through the ranking member. I think the solution that Pete's talking about is kind of the comprehensive solution, the best practice to ensure that the person that you have is who they say they are, that they're really a legitimate applicant for the services. I think some of the things that maybe we're missing on the pandemic unemployment assistance program side of things were just some smaller basic steps that can be used to, if not verify eligibility, then to at least flag a case as potentially being fraudulent. And so, what do those things look like? Well, if it's somebody who's applied for unemployment assistance in the past, are they applying now through the PUA program and asking to have the funds routed to a different bank account? And I think I heard mention earlier of if somebody's applying for services, down in Southwest Ohio, is the IP address coming from Russia or China? And so I think there are some common sense things like that maybe in and of themselves aren't enough to say that the application is fraudulent, but at least can say, hey, let's flag that one. Let's take a look at it and make sure that it's a valid claim before paying it out. But unfortunately, with the federal pay and chase model, and in the midst of COVID, I just don't think that was happening. I think people were prioritizing getting benefits out to folks. And then, if it was fraudulent, well, we'll just figure that out later and try to go get it back.
Yeah, I'll add a couple thoughts. I think you bring up a good point, Congressman, about the faces that could be on a fake Facebook page or fake LinkedIn. What we do is we have presentation attack detection. And what that is you take a picture of your face that ensures that it's a live photo. You cannot take a picture of a picture. We can immediately see that is a fake or fraudulent picture, and it's best practices by what thieves are doing. And so when we deployed that technology to California and other states, immediately the fraud rate went down. We look across all of our federal partners since we are a network, and we can see what good practices look like, such as the VA. The VA has a 5 to 10% fraud rate, and they don't get through because you have to actually be a veteran to match against eligibility, right? Identity verification is the first leg, then there's eligibility. So for PUA claims, they sort of went away with some of the eligibility criteria and focused on identity. Once we insert a presentation attack detection, a selfie with liveness, that we're the only people that do this, immediately you're going to get down to fraud rates that are mimicking what good looks like. Without it, you're going to see 20, 30% of people that are trying to game the system, taking pictures of you because you're a public figure. Your own governor has had unemployment filed in his name. So it's a problem out there. And if you don't have this type of solution, it's going to continue to be pervasive.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you again. Thank you. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington.
Thank you, Ranking Member Walorski. For Amy Simon, Amy, who is responsible for fraud prevention as it relates to the unemployment insurance or the enhanced unemployment insurance benefits? So who is that one person who is the head of some bureau or some undersecretary of some division in some government office with a name? Could you help me?
Yeah, sure. I can. Yes. If I can just add one quick PS on the last two questions, which Pete was answering as well. But I think just quickly on the technology solutions, ID verification is in some sense the second line of defense. I think first you need to have the kind of best in class software on the front end defending your application portal. And I think if you could cut down volume there, take care of bots, take care of people who are credential stuffing, you can prevent so many folks from even getting an application started who are not, in the sort of intangibles, they are not who they say they are, so that when folks get to the ID.me or equivalent layer, you have a much smaller volume. States can actually handle that. So I think one of the ways that the department could be helpful is honestly establishing security solutions that all 53 systems need to adhere to. And whether that's NIST or wherever, this is the standard to make sure that every state in some sense has a baseline similar security procedure. But to your actual question, I think a little bit of context would be helpful. So the regular unemployment insurance system, states fund it, employers pay in some cases employees pay in as well. And typically the recovery rate and the fraud rate in that system, although it's 10%, often many of those benefits are recovered from folks' paychecks later. And so fraud was typically not a huge problem in the traditional UI program. In the CARES Act, with the establishment of PUA, the decision to make PUA a self-certification program because of the pandemic, in effect, opened a gigantic door. So states had never had to require the kinds of information that they were requiring because they're looking at a totally new category of workers, right? You're looking at 1099 folks, you're looking at people who aren't in covered employment, right? It's non-W-2 employment. And there's a self-certification requirement, which means I just need to check a box and say this thing happened to me. So in some sense, the statutory design of the program facilitated fraud. You have retroactive payments, you have $600 extra a week on top of whatever your state's average WBA was. So there are a lot of elements to this that are very PUA specific, and some of those things have gotten tightened over the past year, whether it was in the CAA, which passed at the end of the year, or the stimulus bill. So I do want to say that the regular UI program, the folks who are responsible to manage fraud in that program, I think have been working very hard to do just that. And the UI system is a federal-state partnership, so the U.S. Department of Labor is responsible to make sure that the 53 systems color inside the lines, both in how their state laws are arranged and how their tax structures are running, but also then in how they're actually implementing it. And I would note that unemployment insurance is not like other benefit programs. It has very specific requirements to pay benefits when due. You can't just, flip the switch off on suspicion of fraud. There's a lot of very specific UI things. So when I think about who's responsible, who's the one person, the sad answer is there isn't just one person. But I do think the U.S. Department of Labor, Employment and Training Administration, is in some sense the federal lead on what this system looks like, and they are setting the bar for what states are expected to do, and they have some of the tools to wrangle states to a more consistent anti-fraud stance. States can't get out of the fact that the statutory design of the program allows some kinds of fraud to be rampant, and so some states have been very creative to do the things that they can do to maybe not give retroactive payments all in one structure, so you don't get a $15,000 check, for instance. Some states have gotten stricter security protocols, which have cut down the fraud. So anyway, that's an answer, but maybe not the one you wanted. So
well, we gotta leave it there, Jody.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
You set him on a mission for the rest of his life. I will guarantee you. He'll come back to you and tell you exactly who is responsible.
Yeah, come find me. We can chat.
Yeah. Thanks so much. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Walorski. One of the things, Representative Tarwater, you were talking about just the amount of fraud that happened in the Kansas system and the issues there. Can you talk a little bit about individuals that were affected by fraud and or that were then having difficulty getting their unemployment because of a fraudulent issue, or just general response in total from the Kansas Department of Labor?
Yes, sir, I'd be glad to. Thank you for the question. So that's the whole crux of this deal. Is there's a big human side to this. The human issue is that while we were spending so much time sifting through thousands of fraudulent claims, there were thousands of Kansans that were losing their cars and losing their houses and trying to feed their children. We've spoken to people that haven't worked since March that called in sometimes hundreds of times a day and never got an answer. That's despite hiring 450 people in a call center. Not sure if they're all working or not, but that's what we're told. Kansas that need the dollars can't get them, yet we're just sending them out in the millions to people that are stealing them. And so, there's a huge human element to this. And when it comes to companies, the employers are they stop trusting the companies. They think the companies have been hacked, and they get these notices, especially in the aviation industry. Several of them thought that when they got this notice that they've lost their job, and it was terrifying to them. And so the human element is huge. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. And you talked a lot about, or you mentioned as part of your discussion that the state being told that they were held harmless for fraud may not have motivated them to actually go out and address that. Are there things that you can think of that might be approaches that we could take in the future to help make sure that, one, we address the fraud and incentivize the states to go address that before they view it as an issue that they don't have to be concerned about?
Yes, so thanks for that question. We're working on that currently, and we've developed a modernization council. I've started to meet with some of the other states. Nebraska is one of them that I just recently met with, and they've got a lot of good ideas. We set aside $100 million for a new modernization system that has all the checks and balances. Nebraska spent $4 on an off-the-shelf program that works quite well. And one of the things we learned from them was, and you know this as well because your wife serves with me in the House of Representatives, and one of the things that she came up with real early was, what about the Patriot Act? I thought people had to in order to open accounts, they had to have an identification and walk in and prove who they were. Yet there are banks that allow that, no ID at all, or little identification at all. And those were the problem that Nebraska identified real early on. And so they don't accept claims from bank accounts that don't require identification. And so that was something we learned right off, because that's where most of the money went.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate you taking the time to come today. And obviously there's some issues that we need to address as we move forward. And with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Ferguson.
Thank you, Jackie. And Mr. Eskew, I want to go back to the comments that you made in your opening remarks about about the difference between New York and Ohio, and New York using identification and Ohio not. Tell me, explain to me a little bit more about that. And is there a place where we can go and find out which states are in fact using the proper identification piece, and specifically my great state of Georgia? I'd like to know where we fit into the context of that.
Yes, sir. So Ohio does use an identity verification company. It's just not adherent to NIST 863-3 standards. So they don't have as many checks in place. They rely on document verification and most likely knowledge-based questions. Both of those are much easier to beat if you don't require a selfie with liveness, if you don't require to have a phone that you paid for more than 6 months in your name, in addition to those other two steps. And so identity thieves know that, and they see that, and they talk about it on the dark web. There's a cottage industry out there where people are selling stolen identity, whether it's from these various breaches that we've all referenced, or it's from the more social engineering aspects that's taking place today, where people are collecting and selling information. One of the gentlemen cited driver's license. The driver's license coming out of China and various Asian countries are very good and very hard to spot fakes. But again, it's impossible to dupe and fake a face liveness scan, as well as paying my cell phone bill or your cell phone bill for up to 6 months plus. Georgia where I'm also from, has adopted ID.me in part of their process. Now, Amy's talked about 53 different states or territories. I'd actually double that because there's UI and PUA claims and PUA processes that have popped up overnight. Now, Georgia, as you know, was suffering or actually at all-time low unemployment rates prior to PUA and therefore hadn't invested a lot into the Georgia Department of Labor program. Now, there are three types of pathways for an individual to go through and claim their benefits. There are net new applicants. There are folks that have been siphoned off for having flags on their application. And then there's this phenomenon of recertification or going back every week or every month in order to prove your identity. Georgia needs to do that last part, as do most other states, to ensure that they are cleaning out the system that has launched since more than a year ago prior to having these more controls in place. That will help clean out and prevent fraud from going forward. One last comment I'll make, sir, is that when we've done this with a couple states, we have seen the number of claimants drop by more than half, where people aren't even coming to try and get these benefits because they know they can't get through an ID.me system, and thus they'll go to a state that doesn't use us.
Okay. So when you have worked with states like New York and others to implement the full gamut of security to prove who you are, this has been done with both Democrat governors, Democrat legislatures, Republican governors, Republican legislatures. Have you had any major pushback from outside groups, corporate entities, political organizations when you go in and raise the question about identifying who you are in order to receive government benefits?
Good question. I believe you're hitting the nail on the head, which is this is a nonpartisan challenge. I would say there's been a focus in the local media and local press a lot of times on people not gaining access to their benefits. It's interesting because a lot of people reach out to us or reach out to their local press who are in fact trying to game the system themselves, who are in fact criminals trying to get through and trying to play at our heartstrings to get through. And again, there's a lot of individuals that are hurting out there.
But bottom line, you haven't seen the massive pushback on proper identification in order to receive unemployment benefits.
We have not. We've seen that states struggle to adopt new technology, and there are incumbent players out there that are entrenched, that are doing everything they can to spread misinformation about a company like ours to try and keep their space. But when the best way it works is when states are honest with their constituents, when they're telling them that fraud is a big problem and we're going to adopt the best in breed technology and we're going to do our best to stamp this out, that goes better than anything else.
I couldn't agree more, and I think we should apply that across all of our government agencies and all of our boards. So thank you for that. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I now like to recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn.
Thank you, Jackie. It's great to see everyone here. A lot of great questions asked. This is something, as I mentioned, that's been very near and dear to my heart. At last count, my wife's company had gotten something like 767 false claims since September. It's insane. I went by the office today to see her, and 2 more today. So this is something we got to get after. You know, one of the things I always think about when I hear it's only been in Congress for 2 years is when we hear these issues, it's very easy for the Democrats to want to federalize everything to make sure that they can take care of it because they're the smartest people in the room. I think about healthcare and voting, and now we have UI fraud, and we think about jobs. And so I think we always got to keep that in mind, is how do we understand the problem, help commonize the solution, and help best practices be applied. And I experienced that for 35 years across the McDonald's restaurant system, where with this give and take about who has real control. It goes back to my colleague from Texas who's in charge of this issue. But, you know, I think Ms. Simon really did a great job of talking about, you know, standards. And I think what Mr. Eskew was talking about there is you know, I'm sure he's not afraid of competing, but we need companies like his that are out there challenging. And I know there are probably other companies on here as well, but those two are just the most recent examples. But I look at the states, and I've said this about so many things. I ran on the idea that we get government out of the way. But I look at the states as sort of a 52 laboratories in this case of best bets, examples of best bets. And we do need to have, I don't know if it's the Department of Labor, I don't know who it is exactly, but we need somebody as my colleague was just mentioning, that it's sort of a clearinghouse of great examples that we can say, okay, this is working. And I think Mr. Eskew just mentioned it. There are states who don't even get attempted fraud because their systems are too good. And so we need to obviously put that ownership on those state workers' comp divisions, or not workers' comp, but unemployment divisions, so that they're making sure their systems are secure. Because we also have this same issue with the stimulus checks. I've received emails with issues on a federal level that we've got going on. So this is not just to the states. We have our own issues at the federal level as well. So anyway, with that, I just think for this time, this has been a great hearing. I wish our colleagues across the aisle, I hope they're listening in. I hope you've given them a direct line, Jackie, so they can listen as well. But it's great stuff, and we'll move forward. Thank you so much. Thanks to all the witnesses.
Thanks so much. I'd like to recognize from West Virginia, Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Jackie. I'd like to direct my questions to Leslie again. Could you tell me if you left anything out of your long process, or did you pretty much cover it in your early description?
I pretty much covered it. The only thing that I didn't tell you is that as an employer, we can't provide legal or financial advice to our employees. We can just suggest them. And so nowhere in this process did I receive notice from the SBA or for Workforce West Virginia or anybody else that my identity had been compromised. So as the end person that's impacted by this, you have to really start the process yourself. And you have to follow all of those steps without any guidance or notification, like with Equifax or Yahoo or any of the other data breaches. They notify you there's been a breach. But in this case, you have to discover it.
Okay, as an employer or an employee, but as a mother, I can't imagine how exhausting and emotional this experience has been for you. I mean, how did it affect your family life?
Well, first of all, pandemic, crazy. We had 2 children at home and 1 child in college when all of this is hitting, and it never fails. It always comes in on Friday at 4 o'clock. It's the beginning of a holiday long weekend. It's the beginning of your week of vacation. And it just pulls you into an immediate crisis mode of how do I recover and stop this? And all along you're fighting something that you don't know what it is. You can't beat these people. So it's just, you just feel powerless, and that trickles down onto your family, who's already just so stressed out about the pandemic and trying to be safe and follow all the rules and wear your mask. It's just one more thing to have to deal with. It's stressful.
But it's interesting that you said 4 o'clock Friday, because that timing really does kind of put you over a barrel. Can you tell how this also disrupted your work and how it shifted your focus maybe away from what you needed to be doing to what you needed to be doing?
Yeah, there are so many steps that have to be followed. We have to notify the employees. We have to talk to them about what the breach is. And talking with my HR colleagues across the state and higher education, it's each one of us that are getting hit. I had one community college that says, oh, I haven't gotten any. And the next week they called me and they got 7 that day. So our payroll departments, our HR offices, we're having to educate these employees. And a lot of the claims they're catching, right? Workforce West Virginia is doing a great job. We've had over 60 claims. They've caught all but 2 of them. But they have paid out over $3,000 in fraudulent unemployment claims for just little old WVSOM. And so we know that the SBA has paid out $8,000 on just my claim. So I can't imagine, when you add up all of these costs and the time that it's taken to investigate them and prove them as fraud, how much that's costing all of us in the long run.
Well, I thank you for sharing your experience and your time, and I'll yield back what's left of mine.
Thanks, Representative Miller. I just wanted to thank all of you again for being here. You shared your wisdom. You brought clarity to a subject that is costing this country unbelievable amount of money. And I thank you so much as we continue to take this on the Ways and Means Committee. You've helped us define something, I think, that'll put us much closer to getting to a solution. So to every one of you, I say thank you, and our time is up. And Doug, if you would give a shout out to my good friend Todd Rokita, I'd appreciate it. And to everybody else, thank you so much. Have a great day. Thanks for your wisdom.